Uh, okay. Um, Let me press got it here. All right. Well, I'm going to read for a bit. I'm really happy to be doing this with all of the people who I can't quite see right now because I'm in speaker view myself. But it's nice to hear and see you. And okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to read some bits from the grand piano, and I'm going to read two older poems with some of my commentary and then some new poems. So I'm going to start with a bit from, I think it's 6, but I'm not quite, I don't remember which number, but it's, I'll just start. I was standing in front of MoMA reading a pocket-sized Biographia Literaria while waiting to meet Norman Fisher. As a writer, Zen teacher, former abbot of the Zen Center in San Francisco, and a close friend for decades, Norman has my love and esteem, and in his presence, I feel myself happily undefended. While waiting, I was rereading Coleridge's account of the foundations of his poetics. The pompous title, Biographia Literaria, had always been a bit of a speed bump, but the physical book was small, easily stashable in my pocket, and I still actually have it. It's this little guy here. Easily stashable in my pocket, in my jacket, and thus my need to be accompanied by meaningful sets of words in public space could be discreetly pocketed. And in the right light, the Biographia seems analogous to the grand piano project in that both are glances back across decades at the construction of writing spaces. As I say, I'd read it before, but now in between my scans up and down 53rd Street, the book remained recalcitrant, quite unthrilling, and the type was tiny. Then suddenly one passage triggered the excitement that can make reading so pleasurable, some combination of recognizing things perfectly and at the same time being surprised by the turns, new sense arising out of old word noise. When Norman showed up, I had just read the following, and this is Coleridge now. I have attempted to illustrate the present state of our language in its relation to literature by a press room of larger and smaller stereotype pieces, like a printing shop with hunks of type in it. A press room of larger and smaller stereotype pieces, which in the present Anglo-Gallican fashion of unconnected epigrammatic periods, it requires but an ordinary portion of ingenuity to vary indefinitely and yet produce something which, if not sense, will be so much like it as to do as well. Perhaps better, for it spares the reader the trouble of thinking, prevents vacancy while it indulges indolence. Hence, of all trades, literature at present demands the least talent or information, and of all modes of literature, the manufacture of poems. Unquote. I liked the semi-prophetic analogies you could make from Coleridge's words. The sniffy Anglo-Gallican fashion was like contemporary, as in 2005 contemporary, tutting over the dense prose of French theory. Coleridge's unconnected epigrammatic periods like sentence, unconnected epigrammatic sentences, could be a version of the new sentence. A press room of larger and smaller stereotype pieces could prefigure Flarf's internet appropriations or suggest the materiality of language in general. But my excitement came from watching a powerful verbal boxer landing real blows, spares the reader the trouble of thinking, prevents vacancy while it indulges indolence. And the final phrases, a solid 1-2, knocking literature and especially poetry, that hapless hostage to the present state of the language, clean out of the ring. Besides being an excited witness, I was also a recipient of this anti-poetic aggression. In other words, he's talking to me about my sense of knowledge, etc. I can feel hailed from this direction. My enthusiasm for jumping into discussions on topics that are new to me, which I'm sure many of you are all too familiar with, easily flips over into feeling out of it, bereft of all the crucial information. But the wallops of Coleridge's prose were targeted more dramatically at Coleridge himself, the poet whose vast stores of talent and information were of increasingly little help to him in the manufacture of poems. At this point, Norman arrived, and I said, "Here, read this," putting the book in his hand and pointing to the right part of the page with its 9-point prose. An odd greeting, certainly, but I trusted Norman to receive it with some kind of balanced spirit. He did, laughing in surprise at the end of the last sentence. This mirrored and in fact doubled my own perception, making the passage funnier and starker. Such moments of shared recognition are the anchor points of my poetic practice. And I should add, not just shared recognition, but any kind of interaction, including disagreement, is kind of what activates words and writing for me, being in other people's minds and then sort of rebounding into my own mind. Now I'm going to read two old poems, China and Confession, that have been reprinted in an anthology, Conceptualisms, edited by Steve Tomasula. I was asked to provide some commentary on them, and I will read some of that commentary here. So first, the commentary on China. Well, first, there's some intro stuff. China is from my third book, Primer, 1981. Confession from my ninth, The Future of Memory, 1998. By accident, China, and very much by accident, China became something of a poster child for language writing. Confession addresses it purposely. But neither poem is at all typical of the practices that get called language writing, various as these can be. In fact, both poems situate themselves outside the panoply of those practices. Confession explicitly in what it says and how it says it, China implicitly in its everyday syntax and child-friendly tone. As a free-floating set of lines or paragraphs, China was formally a one-off in Primer, though it shared that book's impulse to use ordinary language to pry the ordinary apart from the inside. But whatever I might have thought, China was received quite differently once Frederick Jameson, in the title essay of his postmodernism book, used it along with other art practices, Warhol, Cage, Bonaventura Hotel, etc., as evidence for a new cultural dominant, the postmodern, which seems so ancient now, doesn't it? Jameson read China as an example of parataxis in the breaking of the signifier-signified bond. These more or less align with other often cited language qualities of non-narrativity and non-referentiality. Pache Jameson, I wrote China looking at a Chinese picture book I bought in Chinatown in San Francisco around the time Francie and I had our first child. I had children's books on the brain. It must have been this book an early reader. There were a couple of Chinese characters on each page. The cover had a red circle containing the number 3, indicating third level, I guess. The circled 3 is where the first line comes from. For me, the book was a compelling sequence of bright, pre-linguistic generalizations, or early linguistic generalizations. The scenes were Chinese, but in a kind of ad hoc negative capability, I identified with the simple 4 color pictures: family, kitchen, school, rivers, airports, village festivals. They became a writing script for a diagram of, quote, the world. I wrote one line to a page, more or less, often coming close to the diction of children's books. Quote, as it fell, what could the doll do? Nothing. Despite the ingenuous tone of some lines, irony does appear in the assertions of collectivity. Nobody from other planets or from heaven tells us what to do, but that doesn't mean that we don't tell each other what to do. A similar tension appears in a later line. Everyone enjoyed the explosions. It's one thing if it's a rural village celebrating the new year with firecrackers, which is what the picture showed. then there's solidarity, camaraderie. But if the context is the Vietnam War, the explosions are deadly. Everyone loses everyone loses its communal character and embodies colonialist violence. The addressee of China may be a quasi-child, but the speaker captioner is an adult. And here is the poem along with the pictures that I wrote from. And now I'm going to hope this works. We go here. Now, can you see this, folks? I can't hear you, but I'm assuming you can. Yes, you can see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, China. We live on the third world from the sun. Number 3, nobody tells us what to do. The people who taught us to count were being very kind. It's always time to leave. If it rains, you either have your umbrella or you don't. The wind blows your hat off. The sun rises also. I'd rather the stars didn't describe us to each other. I'd rather we do it for ourselves. Run in front of your shadow. A sister who points to the sky at least once a decade is a good sister. The landscape is motorized. The train takes you where it goes. I'm somehow missing, my sequence is off from the book, but anyway. The landscape is motorized. The train takes you where it goes, bridges among water. There's the train taking you where it goes. Folks straggling along vast stretches of concrete, heading into the plain. Don't forget what your hat and shoes will look like when you are nowhere to be found. Coats in the window hung up on hooks, question marks where the heads would normally be. I think well, okay. Even the words floating in air make blue shadows. If it tastes good, we eat it. The leaves are falling. Point things out. Pick up the right things. Hey, guess what? What? I've learned how to talk. Great. The person whose head was incomplete burst into tears. As it fell, what could the doll do? Nothing. Go to sleep. You look great in shorts, and the flag looks great too. Everyone enjoyed the explosions. Time to wake up, but better get used to dreams too. Okay, well, that seemed to work. So anyway, that's China. And okay, the next one. I wrote Confession after we moved to Philadelphia, and I was teaching at Penn. For a couple of years, I was interested in messing with the boundaries of poetry and prose and wrote in couplets of 6-word lines. Confession is one of those pieces. Originally, as I remember it, it was entitled Confessing to the Listserv, and I sent it to the Buffalo Poetics Listserv in a kind of friendly polemic, since as a chatty, dramatic monologue, the poem was transgressing against various innovative norms. I mean, confessional poetry and normative language and et cetera, et cetera. Here it is, Confession. Aliens have inhabited my aesthetics for decades, really since the early 70s. Before that, I pretty much wrote as myself, though young. But something has happened to my memory, my judgment. Apparently, my will has been affected. That old stuff, the fork in the head, first home run, dad falling out of the car. I remember the words, but I can't get back there anymore. I think they must be screening my sensations. I'm sure my categories have been messed with. I'd look at the anthologies in the big chains and campus bookstores, even the small press opium dens, all those stanzas against that white space. They just look like the models in the catalogs. The models have arms and legs and a head, and poems mostly don't. But other than that, it's hard, for me anyway, to tell them apart. There's the sexy underwear poem, the sturdy work boot poem you could wear to a party in a pinch, the little blaspheming dress poem. There's variety, you say. The button-down Oxford with the off-rhymed cuffs, the epic toga showing some ancient ankle, the behold, the world is changed and finally I'm normal, flowing robe and shorts, the full nude, the scatter. Yes, I suppose there's variety, but the looks, those come on and read me for the inner you I've walked onto with my cultural capital sensing device looks. No thanks, J. Peterman. No thanks, ordinary evening in New Haven. I'm just waiting for my return ticket to have any meaning, or those saucer-shaped clouds to lower. The authorities deny any visitations. Hardly a surprise. And I myself deny them. Think about it. What could motivate a group of egg-headed, tentacled, slimier than thou aestheticians with techniques far beyond ours to visit Earth, abduct naive poets, and inculcate them with other worldly forms that are also, if you believe the tabloids, salacious? And these abductions always seem to take place in some provincial setting. Isn't that more than slightly suspicious? Why don't they ever reveal themselves hovering over some New York publishing venue? It would be nice to get some answers here. We might learn something about poetry, if nothing else, but I'm not much help since I'm an abductee, at least in theory. Though, like I say, I don't remember much. But this writing seems pretty normal. Complete sentences, semicolons, yada, yada. I seem to have lost my avant-garde card in the laundry. They say that's typical. Well, you'll just have to use your judgment, Earthlings. Judgment, that's your job. Back to work, as if you could leave, and you thought gravity was a problem. So that's the poem, and my comment is, few poems are at all future-proof. Confession certainly isn't. Future readers will be ever less likely to recognize the Seinfeld gestures, J. Peterman, the pretentious clothing catalog, yada, yada. Yada, yada, I think, has staying power. And if readers don't know I'm identified as a language writer, then the mystery of the alien abduction might well remain pretty opaque. I hope the swirling mix of satire and earnestness will remain legible. One person, syntactically, speaks throughout, but who? At the end, it seems to be an alien addressing gravity-bound, history-bound Earthlings. But in other places, it's me. Confession is not just a send-up of the dramatic confessional monologue. That old stuff, the fork in the head, first home run, dad falling out of the car, is in fact autobiographical. My father did have a drinking problem. I was a baseball enthusiast. My sister, so I'm told, did stick a fork in my head when I was a toddler. Apparently it stayed, kind of. However, language being multiplicious, any word or phrase can be the fork, the site of the branching off. Is the avant-garde something to take seriously? Losing my avant-garde card in the laundry sounds like blunt satire, but is the avant-garde the target, or is it myself as a lapsed innovative poet? Is confession avant-garde, anti-avant-garde, or just ordinary? Sometimes it seems like a Turing test. Alien or human, avant-garde or ordinary. Perhaps when the flying saucers return, such categories will have merged. Okay, that's my commentary there. Now here is an excerpt from a GP4 from a piece called Utopia No Place. And I spread out the letters a la language without equal signs, but it says Utopia No Place. And if you read all those letters together, in the middle there is piano, the PIA of Utopia, and then NO of place. Utopiano place, Utopia No Place. I was very proud of that. Han. Okay. And here's some sections from that. And Bruce is going to be in this. So I'm glad he's here. I'll be using utopia to gesture toward the situation of the grand piano, as well as the ostensible time and place under discussion, the Bay Area in the late 70s. The stated project, quote, an experiment in collective autobiography, does have a utopic tinge. It undoes, at least verbally, binaries of inward and social. It assumes that there is some call to be autobiographical, that our collective trajectories remain of interest. And in avant-garde fashion, it's an experiment. And it's transgressive, at least of our old non-narrative habits. In Thomas More's Utopia, separation was the founding gesture. Utopus Rex, which means King Utopus, commanded a trench be dug to cut Utopia off from the mainland. A friend of Erasmus, why am I saying Erasmus? Oh yeah, a friend of Erasmus reviewing Moore's Utopia described this in a dedicatory poem. And here's this poem. Me, once a peninsula, Utopus Rex made an island, alone among all nations, without complex abstraction. I set the philosophical city before the human reader. Moore's Utopia is a crescent-shaped island enclosing a placid harbor. But the entrance is full of submerged rocks, and, quote, the channels are known only to the utopians, so hardly any strangers enter the bay unpiloted. And even the utopians could not enter safely without some landmarks on the coast. If they should shift these landmarks about, they could lure an enemy fleet, no matter how large, to destruction. Suddenly, the structural containment of this project, the Bay Area, the 70s, the 10 by 10 grid, triggers my unease. Utopia and I'm thinking of utopia as a defensive, walled off place. The trench. Okay, another section of the same piece. May 2007, New York. And this is just an excerpt from it. A panel at the Bowery Poetry Club, Language, Writing, and the Body, organized by Tim Peterson, as that person was then, now Trace, and Erica Kaufman, with Steve Benson, Leslie Scalapino, Maria Damon, and Bruce Andrews. And I give thumbnail sketches of the first three, but I'm skipping those. Bruce read what at first sounded like a version of Language, Writing, Poetics circa 1970 to 80, rehearsing emphatically problems with constructing narrative, representation, and voice. Outside of a mention of the materiality of text, he didn't discuss the body particularly. If it was a question of the author's body, then Language, Writing, quote, took a pass on that. He set up an opposition between liberated reader and oppressive text. But then, in a surprise move, he declared that his preceding words were paraphrases of US politicians circa 1948, as they considered what to do about the Soviet Union. In the question period, I asked about what couldn't be made to understand his point. Was the Soviet Union language writing in his allegory? Or was it the younger generation that was the Soviet Union, which then made language writing George Kennan? Circumstances told against getting a clear answer, or let's just say I wasn't getting it. Erica moved through the audience with a handheld mic that the questioner was to take and then give back after speaking. I think exigencies of recording dictated this procedure, but it made conversation between panel and audience difficult. It was already awkward for me to ask a follow-up question, and when I started to ask a third, Francie poked me in the ribs and I stopped. Which I think was wise of her. All right. I was struck by the difference from the talks, where, in my memory at least, collective conversation was primary. Cheap tape recorder, though perhaps a portable tape recorder was an up-to-date technological manifestation in 1977. I don't know. No cover charge, though I'd sometimes pass the hat. 6 packs of buckhorn were at one point a utopian 89 cents. An open loft space where Francie and I were often quite happy, though I also remember being rather scared of it at times. A prior tenant had removed many of the partitions that had formed the narrow hall instead of rooms and paid it. So in other words, the ceiling, all the 2x4s that held the ceiling up were missing. A few 2x4s remained, more or less holding up the ceiling, which was the roof of the 3-story building, sagging across the 16-foot span. When 30 or 50 people were there for a talk, I remember my background hum of concern that the roof or the building, some part of the floor, something would collapse, a slightly eggshell circumstance. The rather violently cleared space and tape recorder and focused openness of the scene, no gate, no protocols, no set form, no requirements outside of a title to put on the flyer. All that meant that conversations could be followed out. The circumstances were utopian for the self-made neophyte who always talked whenever I didn't understand something, and often enough when I thought I did. I should make it clear that I'm being sarcastic, though I wonder just what the slant of the sarcasm is. Am I being sarcastic about myself or utopia or both? Beneath the sarcasm, I detect a utopic demand that I acted out in the talks. I wanted to understand what people were saying and felt that this need was of communal use. Barry, I know, thought I interrupted him excessively in his first talk on objectivism. I remember, on the contrary, the feeling that it was possible to have everything clarified, a feature of utopian scenes of instruction, no prerequisites. I don't recognize Ron's description in an earlier essay of people pacing with tension at the talks, though Steve has seconded Ron. Francie reminds me that everyone sat on the floor. Pacing might have had to do with getting up to stretch. I do remember that the power imbalance between the genders was obvious. I mean, you know, the guys, few of the guys spoke all the time. And here's Ron's line from What? I'm quoting from memory. The behavior of alpha males at a talk. At a party after the panel, Bruce and I were talking half seriously. There were certainly martinis flying around. I was still trying to figure out what he meant. He reminded me that on the panel, he had always referred not to language writing, but to so-called language writing, by which he intended to invoke the loose historical designation. When I asked Bruce if there was such a thing as language writing, or, underlining the joke, if he believed in language writing, as opposed to so-called language writing, he replied, yes, there was a coherent position to take. Language writing, if there was going to be such a thing, would be defined by specific formal features, no narrative, no representational description, and my inexact transcription of party chit-chat. I said that in the Marginalization of Poetry book I wrote, I had written that Ketchak, Ron's Ketchak, could be read as a kind of novel, and that Ohota, Lynn's Ohota, in fact, calls itself a novel. So does that make Ron and Lynn not be language writers? Bruce nodded. And Ray and Carla would not be language writers. I, of course, would not be one. Perhaps, I suggested, there is in fact only one example of a language writer, and that would be precisely you, Bruce. He smiled. But after smiling through my joke, Bruce said that, of course, there were many people who wrote language writing. It's just that they weren't confined to certain places or generations. He was interested in language writing, not language writers. He gave examples, and again, my memory only supplies approximations. But let's say Ton Lynn's bullwhip lotion giraffe would be language writing. Okay, I'm going to stop that section there. And now I'm going to read some new poems, and then I'll be done. Okay. First poem is untitled. Oh my God, I used to let my consciousness explode in perfect company and kind of remember it afterwards via tape recordings, amid a sense of happy fatigue, buoyed by a crowd-sourced vocabulary of common appetites that had no beef with otherness. It was a panocracy, the rule of all, plus the uncanceled noise. This one has a title. It's called Chatty Fossils. When you dig us out of the shale, you'll see our legs mattered a lot. You'll sense how the tilt of our pelvises threw all that weight on our heads, how we carried it, striding, storming citadels, how we kept standing, even as our data was going up in smoke, how we sat crammed in illuminated boxes, never given our due, what we had taken from us. This is called YouTube in the Spring, and it's in memory of Patty Collins, who died of ALS and at the end had to communicate by moving her eyes over a screen. YouTube in the Spring, in memory of Patty Collins. Life likes to keep its trajectory secret, but just brush the button lightly with your eyes if you have to. And here you are again, hearing it, the musicians touching the notes in all the good places, the overall shape changing, but lingering beyond short-term memory, the light only getting longer. This one is called Otter. Playful mammal, 5 letters. Half moon lit side down, top half same inky blue as night sky. Therefore proving consciousness as more than a match for nothing. If what's gone hasn't left and what's here is already gone, then when it's time to fill in the blank, how can you miss? Through a raindrop. I know it looks like the mother of all, if not problems, but let's keep things in perspective. Gravity hasn't proven much beyond the obvious. Just remember, experience isn't everything. And while I've got you on the line, don't you just hate all the slow-mo? Such an insult to our brevity. And then one more. Epic manners. In 2 parts. 2 short parts. 1, not only are you allowed to repeat, you have to repeat. 1 time is never enough to recognize anything. 2, why the long face, said the bartender to the horse. Why the long story, said the horse to Homer. And Homer said, it's long because I don't use timestamps. I have my own ways of tuning the senses. Plus I know where to stop, a secret not given to all. And that's where I'm stopping.
Thank you, Bob. At this point, we have about 20 minutes for question and answer. I want to note that there are links for acquisition of the entire Grand Piano series in the chat, and you can find them there. And I want to recommend that everybody switch from the speaker view rather than try and figure out what those animals behind Bob actually are, and go over to gallery view so that you can see everybody who is here, or maybe at least half everybody, since I don't think we get 39 to a screen as such. And I am myself making that switch as we do right now. I think that your reading of China, Bob, just to, prime the pump the way you would always ask the first question at Writer's House, that your reading of China with the presence of that book illuminates that text in ways that are fascinating and actually very gently comic. It's really a deep pleasure to hear it that way and see it that way. And I'm curious. Have you read it like that before?
No, I never have.
Or I mean, how did that feel to you? Because it's a very different kind of experience rather than coming through, Fred Jameson's greatest hits.
Well, I'm sort of don't have a good answer to that because I was just doing the mechanics of trying to move the cursor and look down at the line, and so. But in general, I mean, it did remind me of what I felt when I saw that book, and I sort of could go back and remember how I was feeling as I wrote it, and there was, I don't know where it came, I don't know where the rhetoric or the tone or the overall framing gestalt of the feeling came from, but the pictures looked so declarative that it made me want to be very, it was really sort of fun and interesting to be as compact and declarative and straightforward as possible. So you could say, pick up the right things. As it fell, what could the doll do? Nothing. And you could, I mean, I could go out pretty wide too. The person whose head was incomplete burst into tears, but the sentences were short, and so the rhetoric isn't the right word, but the tone of it, I kept looking back at the pictures to refresh the tone somehow.
Okay, Lynn has had her hand up. Francie has her hand up. We'll go with Lynn first.
Okay, well, I agree with Ron that it was both illuminating and kind of gorgeous to hear the poem, to hear China in relationship with the illustrations in that book. I've always read China I've always approached China, the poem, as if it were an allegory, but of what? Like what was the figure that was being allegorized? I never could figure out. It didn't seem like it would be China per se. But Bob, did you think of it as being potentially an allegory or inviting an allegorical reading? And then what about the term avant-garde as allegorical?
Well, that one let me put that one aside for a second. That's really complicated. But the something I cut out some of my description in there, but there certainly was in my own case a kind of hidden polemic with Pound, because I had this. Pound was like my bad pedagogue as he sort of helped make me a poet at 16, reading ABC of Reading and getting all excited and deciding to read quote unquote everything, and that it was sort of easy and both easy and daunting to be a poet, but that anyway, but his whole attitude toward Chinese as the sacred poetic language, I got increasingly fed up with, and it just seemed like he was very smart about some things, and that was not one of them. And so I guess I was trying to really desacralize the language. So if it tastes good, we eat it. That kind of tone, as opposed to sun up to work, dig well, eat of the plow field, eat of the grain. I mean, the Pound's, I'm misquoting Pound's sacralization of his fantasy of purely hierarchical agrarian imperial China. So there was that. I think that was some kind of fuel of escaping from the Pound world into my own experience as a human being who grew up in Youngstown.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense in a way. I mean, if one thinks of allegorical figures as kinds of statuesque, like on a pedestal with the name Liberty or Valor or America or
Uh-huh,
whatever it
uh-huh.
might be on the pedestal. You're toppling one in that like contextual background that you've just described. And I'm guessing you don't want to take on my question about
No, but about
the term
avant-garde and allegory.
avant-garde.
Well, I don't know. Let other people have hands up. Maybe
Yeah, I
they
know
have some more.
Francie does.
Has had her hand up.
I want to say I like it much better without the illustrations. And I think it really cuts out the imagination of what you're saying. I mean, what you say is so enormous and can be so many different things. And then all of a sudden there's an illustration of it. And I don't like that at all. And although it's very interesting in seeing how you got there. So it's just a historical artifact. And it reminds me of when we saw the video at MoMA in the Matisse show of the Red Studio. And they had this wonderful video where the restorers, or whatever they're called, had taken it off the stretcher and were examining when different layers of paint were actually put on. And it was revelatory. It was really completely fascinating. But that's not how we want to be the way that we really are looking at the Red Studio. We want to see it for what imaginative leaps it was making from that thing. And I feel like I learned a lesson about this from when we did Playing Bodies, which, as most people know, is Bob's poems and my paintings. And somebody, I can't remember what her name was, some New York Stein person said to me afterwards, you shouldn't have the paintings with the poems. It takes away from the paintings because you're listening to the words. And it's the same thing. I think she was right. I don't think they should be done together. I'm completely, I mean, I love the book, but it's not successful to me as a way to present those two things. And I don't think you want to present it that way in any kind of permanent thing, or even try and refer to it too specifically.
I see Tom.
Taken.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm sort of, I get convinced very easily. I'm pretty convinced there. Tom has his hand up, I know. Some other people
Tom
too.
does have his hand up.
So may I just pretty quick, I think China has a very, to me, always had a very strong emotional weight of reference that I could never figure out. And now you've presented it to me. And I agree totally with Francie that it wouldn't have been as interesting, that emotional weight, had the illustrations been there originally. It's just interesting as if you will, background or whatever you want to call it. Just interesting because it's interesting, whatever. But it really illuminates. So knowing about that, I mean, sort of learning that there was this object really helped me right now just to figure out what the source had been of the emotional weight of the work. And so I'm grateful for that, as I am for the whole rest of the presentation, Bob, which was really wonderful.
Thank you.
I wanted to just sort of.
David Kellogg has had his hand up for a while, just to
David has?
be able to, yes, yeah, but it's hard to see everybody, so I just thought I would like.
I have missed him, but he's not on my screen. I have to go to the next screen. There he is. Now he's back.
You can resize.
It was not my literal hand, Ron. It was the image of the Zoom hand. So thank you, Carla. I wanted to say, first of all, loved the whole reading. Just and I wanted to talk a little bit about, or ask a little bit about the one of the new poems, and maybe this carries on the question of allegory, and that is Chatty Fossils, which I take is probably obvious. Maybe I'm making an obvious point, but seems to be a gentle send up of the grand piano project itself in some ways, right? And I take the pelvises in that poem to be in part a refiguring of Ron's alpha males at a talk somehow, but I might be wrong there. But and did I hear data or data? Data.
Data,
Just-
D-A-T,
okay,
D-A-T-A.
Just wanted to be clear about that.
Yeah.
But also,
No, you know, it's
also,
funny that
yeah,
that poem, I feel like, I was reading a bunch of early hominid fossil books and all that kind of research into getting by the need to keep upright, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, I mean, I'm being very literal about you know what human bones would say in the future. To you can see, I guess I'm really trying to describe human history in a very short poem, going from and the tilt of the pelvis, throwing that weight on the head. I mean, I do think of
right.
somehow, you know, bipedality and how heavy our brains are, how we have to hold them up all the time. And the illuminated boxes, I was thinking of Zoom and of the one time France and I went to Amsterdam and we saw the women in the boxes, you know, or any office building illuminated boxes. I mean, it's so I'm trying to compress history into 40 words.
Right.
So I didn't think of an allegory. I was really trying to describe the history of humanity. so
Maybe it was
sorry.
just hearing it after the talk about the grand piano made it automatically feel like a response to the grand piano itself, as in the grand piano as a set of chatty fossils, because you're talking about the
Well, we
you
are
know,
chatty fossils. I mean, in that sense, yes, we are
you know,
chatty fossils.
yeah.
You know,
So
we all have a
that's
lot
sort
to
of-
say, even from you know the dust that covers us, right?
Carla and Barry have both had their hands.
Yeah, I'll see to Carla. Carla, go first.
Put her
Unmute,
in,
unmute,
Carla.
unmute.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just muted myself. Well, I actually took my hand down because I felt like it was getting too complicated. But which is fascinating to me in relationship to the poem China. And then, you know, just to say that I found Jameson's use of it preposterous, as I do much of his interpretation of any kind of literary and or aesthetic object. So that's where I'm coming from in that. But I saw, Bob, you showed me the book and the poem, right? Like at the time that you found the book and the poem. And I remember having this like really great conversation with you about it. And I very much appreciate Francie's commentary in the sense that the relationship between image or picture and or illustration and language is something that's incredibly fascinating when one thing is backgrounded or foregrounded or removed entirely. And it's a really, to me, it's been like that kind of thing has been a fascinating, problematic for a very long time. And I found that to be the case at the moment that you showed me that work. But the other thing I wanted to say is that the relationship of being a parent with children to a kid's book in the actual social and cultural milieu that you were in which you found this book in Chinatown and then brought it home to your white family. And all of those distanciations and strangenesses have this kind of ambiguous or presence in the language, which I think has something to do with Francie's commentary about the removal of the illustration. When one feels these kinds of distresses and like positivisms and then shades of critique that you can't totally get your hand on, anxiety, and also just a sort of embrace of a relationship between an adult writer and the idea of and the presence of children. So anyway, so that was just,
You know, so Carla, I think you and I both, I mean, I'm thinking of your use of Carl Sandburg
Mhm.
in some of your work. And we're both really interested in kids and adults and learning language and what you're passing on and what you can't pass on, et cetera.
yeah,
So yeah, no, I mean, when you're addressing a child, it's very, very complicated because you're not just saying recognize this, that I have the language and you need to acquire the language. You're both contemplating existence from different temporal perspectives, and
right. And you're coordinating it together. So
right,
you're entangled in one another. Yeah.
right.
Something
Mhm.
about language learning in another poem in that book, I called the phonemes by 1,000 names.
Oh yeah,
And that could go directly to Jakobson and the ways in which, the babble, turns into the binary oppositions that create phonemes. And suddenly you're interrogating a different developmental stage that still resides within you as a more developed, i.e. adult person. And I think that's something that's incredibly valuable to be able to access or to move across those developmental stages. The comment I was going to make is that, Jameson's reading has to stand as probably one of the most absolute misreadings of this century. It's ferocious, and it's worth seeing the images to see how ferocious. But at the same
well, he
time,
didn't see the images. He
No,
got
I
his
know.
info from Bruce Boone. He thought it was a book of photographs, and
Yeah,
it all fed
It-
into his
it-
machine.
it was the language writing, the pluses and minuses of the new formalism by Bruce Boone in Steve Abbott's magazine. And we were talking earlier, and I commented that, it had this really inky, heavy look, like the poem China was something very alien and disturbing. And Bruce Boone was trying to recuperate that alien disturbance back into a kind of Marxist realism. And he was very confronted by it. There was a lot of antagonism there. So here's something that came out of this, kind of lovely relationship between a parent and a child across cultural boundaries, which I still think is very significant, as Carla said, that gets seen as a form of aggressivity. And I'm going to Lacan, because I think the Lacanian reading certainly is there in Jameson. It's certainly there in the schizoaffectivity of those lines when you see them in isolation. When the doll fell, what could it do? Nothing. I mean, every one of those lines can be unpacked in a register of schizoaffectivity. And
What's a different word for schizoaffectivity?
well, when
Asking for a friend,
Deleuze and Guattari talk about the schizo, they're talking about a kind of dimensionless, presentation of sensory material that has no cognitive explanatory force. It's just one thing falling into another.
Well, that's what Jameson would have
then
thought
you
that
could
I was
look at,
doing.
Jameson's working off Lacan, but then you could also look at a book by Louis Sass, Carl and I read with great horror, called Madness and Modernism. And he describes, looks at, I'm looking at Virginia Woolf in the background, The Waves, as simply a transcript of a mad person. And he's a clinical psychiatrist. And so he basically does DSM-3 at the time on that. So one of the questions would be, when you move away from those images, what accounts for the affective dimension, which does really suggest schizo. You know, I don't think you can, I don't think you can take that reading away from Jameson, you know. But on the other hand, it's a complete misreading of the warmth of your writing. And that's where I'll leave that comment.
I think I would have a response to that through performance, but I'd rather hear what Kathy Lou Schultz has to say. She has her hand up.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, are you in
Yeah.
the car?
I'm in the car. My house has been taken over by teenage boys. So
Okay.
I'm hiding in the car. So thank you so much, Carla. Thank you, Bob. It's lovely to be listening to everyone.
Nice to hear you.
Yes, I'm in the dark in the car. So given the kind of throwaway observations about language writing, you know, it's not really about anything, it's totally non-referential. I just absolutely love it that there is a reference that I could actually hold in my hands and that it's a children's book. But I think that the way I describe your writing is that there's this aboutness, right? So there's an aboutness about referentiality, so that the referent becomes part of the process, that it's not, you know, in the product. And I think that makes sense to me. What Francie is saying, that, you know, if you do have the referent in front of you, those images, it ties it to the referent in a way that doesn't take it to this level of sort of being about referentiality. So that's what I'm thinking.
Well, I mean, I was worried about the sort of puzzle solving opportunity.
Right.
So, you know, I almost pointed out, like, what is it? Jackets and coats hung up on hooks, question marks where the heads would normally be. Well,
Right.
in the picture, the coat hangers, there are little question marks and stuff.
Mhm.
But, you know, that one is much better without the picture
Right.
turning it into a joke.
Right.
You know, having your head be a question mark is kind of the signature move in my case, it seems to me.
Right. And it's humorous to me that it's a kind of a pun, you know, of working off of this children's book that is sort of very direct, you know, simple about, you know, things in everyday life. So it's actually quite funny that it appears as part of the process. But, you know, many things appear as part of the process, like random procedures or whatever, right? So you don't necessarily have to know that when you have the product in front of you, which is the poem, which opens up rather than is tied down to some sort of reference. So thank you.
I have one last comment, and I think we will end.
Ray has her hand up there.
Ray,
Ray, we want Ray.
Ray has
Ray
her
has your
hand,
hand.
and John Allen has his hand also.
And Kathleen also.
Okay.
Ray, you're muted.
Unmute Ray.
Okay, got it. Chuck was making noise in the kitchen, so I muted myself. But anyway, I was just going to ask Bob, just because I'm curious, I wonder how people would have read that poem if it hadn't been titled China. I mean, I understand why it's titled China, but it provoked a lot at that time, especially it provoked a lot of discussion about your attitude towards Marxism, and is this a critique of the new China, or the, you know, blah, blah, blah. So I just wonder what you would say about that question about the title.
Boy, it's a good question. I really don't have an answer. I don't know. Gosh, no, and here I feel like I'm sort of stuck, having seen the pictures that generated the poem. So that's the door I came through.
Mhm.
So I didn't come through another door.
Oh, I'm not being critical of it. I like it, but I'm just wondering how it would have impacted.
No, I know if it had been called Life, you know, or something, or Village, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
John. John Allen, you're muted. I thought you wanted to add.
I don't think I'm muted now.
Now yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to respond to that comment about schizophrenia as a language. I used to work in a homeless shelter, and I'd see schizophrenics come in almost by just almost that they could have had like a ticket. You know, there were so many of them there, and I would listen to the things they would say, and it was like the what they would say had a intuition in it without a body. They're getting to some point that they reach, but it's missing the skin of the language. Kurt Vonnegut, he did a really bitterly amusing kind of anthology called "In the Realms of the Unreal," and he would put poets who were great and who were also schizoaffective or schizophrenic, and then he would put the flat abstract shit that some of them would create, some of them would write. But my favorite poem was the alien poem. I thought it was, because you point out why did the aliens behave the way that we portray them as behaving, and like why in the movies do they have to come down and anally penetrate people and stuff? What's the logic there? What's in the human mind that is producing that kind of a reflection?
It's a good question.
But no, I really enjoyed it, and thank you.
Kathleen.
Say again?
Let's see.
You're muted.
Unmute.
Sort of a post-comment comment. I actually found the illustrations sort of interesting in relationship to the text, although everything that has been said so far, I agree with. So, when Bob, and thank you so much for the reading, you talked about the interest in the desacralization of Pound's idiom. And I thought in a way, in children's books illustrations, the concept of deictic, this pointing.
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear the concept of
deictic. The pointing.
Oh, the deictic. Yeah.
Yes. Like see Dick run, see Jane, so that whether it's a children's closet with, hangers depicting clothing in China or otherwise, there's something about the everyday life aspect of it. So it's pointing to the book, but at the same time, there's a sort of retraction away from the book. So I found it not so much a distraction, but something that was about the materialism of, well, one could say the romantic project that Pound had and how we understand China and language in a political way, but also in our own materialistic way in terms of how we would generate such a piece of writing. So I found it, because it was somewhat displaced, kind of interesting, but utterly familiar. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, well, thank you. Gosh.
Zagat Damaher had his hand raised narratively, so maybe he can jump in physically.
There he is.
Hi. Greetings from Cairo. It's about 4 a.m. here, and I'm quite honored to be among lots of the people I learned from. Bob, I have a question. I've been struggling formulating it, but as a lyrical poet, sometimes like the coffee burns me, so I write the world burned me, and I hide the reference, which is it was just coffee. And I wait for the next event that is worthy of joining this line. Why did you stick to the book all the way? Why you didn't deviate?
I should say, this is the only time I've done that. So in a way, sticking with the book was a funny kind of discipline that I hadn't done before. I mean, I think so I agree that often, displacements are more interesting than straight on charges. But well, and I guess in it's funny. I'm sort of thinking of still of Francie's comment that I'm having to undo some of what I did with the showing the pictures, because there aren't always, not every line in picture is a straight. Some of them are very straight, but some of them aren't. So I don't know why I'm defending myself here.
A lot of it is skewed.
I don't mean to be. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
A lot of it is totally skewed.
Some is skewed, but
And,
some,
and
you
some
know,
of it, and some of it isn't. Some of it is a sort of like rhetorical translation of a rhetorical image, but some of
to
it.
me, the one that is the most least skewed, but in a way it's in a way the weakest. I don't even mean to bring that comparison in, but it's a cheap joke when I say the sun rises also. You know, that's ha ha Hemingway, reverse Hemingway.
But you get it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Alan Golding and Abigail Child both have their hands up. And then I'm going to put a bow on it at the end of that. So, Alan?
Yeah. So, Bob, I've always felt like one of your preoccupations in your writing is what it means to write the present, and be immersed in the present and write it. And I'm thinking back to the moment you narrated of reading the Biographia Literaria outside MoMA, while I'm waiting to meet Norman. So you're reading this, what is it? Close to 200-year-old text that is compelling for you in the present, and then you present it to a friend and colleague in a present that is being narrated in the past. Essentially, my question is, given what I see as your preoccupation with writing in time, how that inflected your writing in the grand piano.
It's there just about every sentence. It's really a major. I mean, I was reading through the pieces working on this talk, and a lot of the sentences are very compacted and jangling with trying to sort of out jump my shadow or something like that. It was trying to trying to catch up with the present as I'm writing in the present, as opposed to, nice past tense, easygoing sentences that describe things that have happened. I mean, there's something very relaxing about a good prose writer who does that. But that was not me. So yeah, it's all over the place.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, Abigail.
I just wanted to say in relation to the visual, and it's sort of been talked about a lot, but I wanted to say what I really enjoyed about it was there were these images, and what I was getting was your brain, how your brain interprets these images in sometimes a very straight way and sometimes off, something about the stars. And for me, it was, and people have said this kind of, but it was very insightful. And I've written off of photographs and in a very different way, but I think watching your brain through that, I'm not saying that's how the poem should always be presented, but it was really a gift, I think, to all of us to have that insight into how you are seeing and creating a world sort of askew from, your particular BP askewness. So thank you.
I totally agree with Abigail about this as a great gift to a group of friends. And thinking also on building on what Ray said earlier about the relationship of the title to the text of that poem. One of the details I have never been able to completely purge from my reading of it is that the other reading series in San Francisco at that time that had any really sustained interest at all was at Canessa Park. And that as you walked up the stairs at Canessa Park, at the very top is a plaque that tells you that Sun Yat-sen wrote the Constitution of China, by which they mean Taiwan, in that room. And so there were all these other readings going on in this place, which has a heavy relationship to China in an odd way that still has never gone away. I mean, I think we're still living through the Nixon-Kennedy Kimoy-Matsu debate on a regular basis.
Thank you.
Oh, if that's it, then I think we should probably close it off. I want to note that on January 12th, Lynn Haginian will be giving the final commentary. I think this is totally, it's a perfect symmetry that she should be the one doing this, and that Bob Perelman will in fact be the moderator on that night. It will be 8 p.m. Eastern time, 5 p.m. Pacific time, and I don't know, 3 in the morning in Cairo. I'm not quite sure about that, but in about 24 hours, Barry will have this up on YouTube, and it will go over to Penn Sound along with the rest of this TV series sometime thereafter. Thank you so much, Bob. You have been amazingly generous to us all.